Executive Summary. The 1973 oil crisis represents one of the most significant economic and geopolitical events of the 20th century, fundamentally altering global energy policy, international relations and economic structures. Spanning from October 1973 to March 1974, this crisis emerged from the intersection of Middle Eastern geopolitics and the global dependence on petroleum, resulting in a quadrupling of oil prices and triggering worldwide economic recession. The crisis demonstrated the vulnerability of industrialized nations to energy supply disruptions and catalyzed profound changes in energy policy, automotive design, and strategic thinking about resource dependency. Historical context and preconditions. Global oil dependence before 1973. By the early 1970s, the industrialized world had become profoundly dependent on petroleum. The post-World War II economic boom, particularly in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, was built on cheap and abundant oil. The American economy had shifted from coal to oil as its primary energy source, while Europe and Japan, lacking substantial domestic petroleum reserves, imported the vast majority of their energy needs from the Middle East. The United States oil production peaked in 1970, a development predicted by geologist M. King Hubbert in his peak oil theory. This meant that America, previously self-sufficient in oil production, was becoming increasingly dependent on imports. By 1973, the U.S. was importing approximately 6 million barrels per day, representing about 35% of its consumption. The structure of global oil markets. The global oil market was dominated by the Seven Sisters, a consortium of Western oil companies including Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Texaco, Gulf Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, and BP. These companies had controlled Middle Eastern oil production through concession agreements since the early 20th century, typically paying host countries minimal royalties while reaping enormous profits. However, this structure began changing in the 1960s. Oil-producing nations increasingly challenged Western control over their resources. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, was founded in 1960 by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela to coordinate petroleum policies and secure fair prices. By the early 1970s, OPEC members were demanding greater control over production and pricing. Political tensions in the Middle East. The Arab-Israeli conflict formed the crucial political backdrop to the crisis. Since Israel's establishment in 1948, multiple wars had been fought between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The Six-Day War of 1967 resulted in Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem, territories that Arab nations sought to reclaim. Egypt, under President Anwar Sadat, was particularly determined to reverse the humiliation of 1967. Syria, led by Hafez al-Assad, shared Egypt's goal of recovering lost territory. Both nations received substantial military and economic support from the Soviet Union, while Israel was backed by the United States, making the conflict a proxy battleground of the Cold War. The United States had developed an increasingly close relationship with Israel, providing military aid, advanced weaponry, and diplomatic support. This alignment reflected both domestic political considerations and strategic Cold War calculations about containing Soviet influence in the Middle East. The Yom Kippur War, immediate trigger. The outbreak of hostilities. On October 6, 1973, the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israeli positions. Egypt struck across the Suez Canal into the Sinai Peninsula while Syria attacked the Golan Heights. The timing was carefully chosen to maximize surprise when Israeli forces were at reduced readiness due to the religious holiday. The initial Arab assault achieved significant success. Egyptian forces breached the Bar-Lev line, Israel's supposedly impregnable defensive fortification along the Suez Canal, using water cannons to create passages through sand embankments and deploying anti-tank missiles to neutralize Israeli armor superiority. Syrian forces advanced into the Golan Heights, threatening northern Israel. International response and superpower involvement. Israel, facing an existential threat, urgently requested American military assistance. President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger initially hesitated, concerned about Arab reactions and hoping for a diplomatic solution. However, as Israeli losses mounted and Soviet transport aircraft began massive resupply of Arab forces, the United States initiated Operation Nickel Grass on October 14, 1973. Operation Nickel Grass represented one of the largest airlifts in history, with American C-5 Galaxy and C-141 Starlifter aircraft delivering tanks, artillery, ammunition, and advanced weaponry directly to Israel. This massive infusion of American military support enabled Israel to recover from initial setbacks and launch counteroffensives. By mid-October, Israeli forces had crossed the Suez Canal, encircled the Egyptian Third Army, and advanced to within 100 kilometers of Cairo. On the Syrian front, Israeli forces pushed beyond the 1967 ceasefire lines and advanced toward Damascus. The military situation had reversed dramatically, with Arab forces now facing potential catastrophic defeat. Ceasefire and diplomatic resolution. The United Nations Security Council, under pressure from both superpowers who feared direct confrontation, passed Resolution 338 on October 22, 1973, calling for an immediate ceasefire. Fighting largely ended on October 25, though sporadic clashes continued. The ceasefire left Israeli forces in advantageous positions but prevented complete Arab military collapse. The war demonstrated several important realities. Arab military forces had improved substantially since 1967, Israeli military superiority was not absolute, and the United States was willing to provide massive support to prevent Israeli defeat. These factors would profoundly influence Arab strategic thinking about using oil as a weapon. The oil embargo, mechanism and implementation. OPEC's strategic decision. Even before the war's military conclusion, Arab oil producers were discussing how to leverage petroleum exports for political advantage. On October 16 to 17, 1973, representatives of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, met in Kuwait to coordinate their response to American support for Israel. OPEC announced a two-pronged strategy. First, an immediate 5% production cut with additional 5% cuts each month until their political objectives were achieved. Second, a complete embargo on oil exports to nations deemed particularly supportive of Israel. Initially the United States and the Netherlands, later expanded to include Portugal, South Africa, and Rhodesia. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, played a crucial role. King Faisal, despite generally pro-Western orientation and close ties to American oil companies, felt compelled by Arab solidarity and Islamic sentiment to support the embargo. His decision was influenced by pressure from other Arab leaders, domestic public opinion, and genuine frustration with American policy toward Palestine. The price revolution. Simultaneously with the embargo, OPEC members unilaterally increased oil prices. On October 16, the Persian Gulf members of OPEC raised the posted price of oil from $3.01 per barrel to $5.11, a 70% increase implemented without consultation with oil companies, marking a revolutionary shift in who controlled pricing. This was only the beginning. On December 23, 1973, OPEC announced another massive price increase, raising the posted price to $11.65 per barrel, nearly quadrupling the pre-crisis price. This dramatic escalation reflected both the tight supply situation created by the production cuts and OPEC's recognition of its newfound market power. The price increases were partially driven by market fundamentals. Global demand had been strong, spare production capacity was limited, and the embargo created genuine supply shortages. However, they also represented a deliberate political and economic strategy to assert control over a vital resource and extract greater economic benefits from oil production. Supply disruption and allocation mechanisms. The embargo's practical impact was complex. Oil is a fungible commodity traded in a global market, making targeted embargoes difficult to enforce completely. While Arab producers stopped direct shipments to embargoed nations, oil could be rerouted through third parties, and non-Arab producers could adjust their export patterns. Nevertheless, the embargo created real supply constraints. Arab OPEC members collectively reduced production by approximately 25%, removing roughly 4 million barrels per day from global supply. Combined with already tight market conditions, this reduction created genuine shortages in consuming nations. The United States received approximately 10% of its oil imports from Arab OPEC members before the embargo, so the direct impact might seem limited. However, the global nature of oil markets meant that disruptions anywhere affected prices everywhere. European nations and Japan, far more dependent on Middle Eastern oil, receiving 70 to 80% of their imports from the region, faced more severe supply constraints. Oil companies and governments implemented allocation systems attempting to distribute available supplies. These systems often proved complex and controversial, with disputes over priorities and accusations of favoritism or profiteering. Economic impact on Western nations. The United States. The oil crisis struck the American economy at a particularly vulnerable moment. The U.S. was already experiencing inflation due to deficit spending on the Vietnam War and Great Society programs, while economic growth was slowing. The oil shock transformed these problems into stagflation, the simultaneous occurrence of stagnation and inflation that conventional Keynesian economics struggled to address. Gasoline prices doubled between October 1973 and January 1974, from approximately 38 cents to 78 cents per gallon. Long lines formed at gas stations, with motorists sometimes waiting hours to fill their tanks. Scenes of mile-long queues and no-gas signs became iconic images of the crisis. Some states implemented odd-even rationing systems, where cars with license plates ending in odd numbers could purchase gas on odd-numbered days, and even-numbered plates on even days. The broader economic impact was severe. The Dow Jones Industrial Average declined 45% between January 1973 and December 1974. Unemployment rose from 4.9% in 1973 to 8.5% by 1975. Inflation accelerated, reaching 11% in 1974. Real GDP growth turned negative. The combination created the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Energy-intensive industries suffered particularly. Airlines faced soaring fuel costs, forcing service reductions and fare increases. Petrochemical manufacturers dealt with both supply constraints and price increases. The automotive industry entered a prolonged crisis as demand shifted away from traditional American products toward more fuel-efficient vehicles. The psychological impact was perhaps as significant as the economic damage. Americans had grown accustomed to cheap, abundant energy as an unquestioned aspect of life. Gas lines and shortages challenged fundamental assumptions about American prosperity and power. The crisis contributed to a broader sense of malaise about American society, compounded by Watergate, Vietnam, and social tensions. Western Europe. European nations, more dependent on imported oil than the United States, faced even more severe challenges. Countries like Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom imported 80 to 90% of their petroleum, with the vast majority coming from the Middle East. The embargo and production cuts created genuine supply crises. European governments implemented various emergency measures. The Netherlands, specifically targeted by the embargo due to its pro-Israeli stance and role as a major oil port, faced particularly acute shortages. The Dutch government implemented Sunday driving bans, restricted heating of buildings, and appealed to citizens to conserve energy. Germany imposed speed limits on the Autobahn for the first time. Britain implemented a 3-day work week for most industries to conserve electricity generated from oil-fired plants. The economic impact mirrored that in the United States. Britain, already struggling with economic problems and labor unrest, entered a severe recession. Germany's export-oriented economy contracted sharply. France attempted to secure preferential oil deals with Arab producers by distancing itself from American Middle East policy, with limited success. The crisis exposed tensions within the European Economic Community (EEC). Attempts to coordinate a common response largely failed as individual nations pursued separate arrangements with oil producers. The Netherlands felt abandoned by EEC partners who refused to share oil supplies, creating lasting resentment and contributing to future debates about European solidarity and integration. Japan. Japan's situation was perhaps most precarious. The world's second-largest economy imported 99% of its oil, with approximately 80% coming from the Middle East. Japan had no strategic petroleum reserves and faced the prospect of industrial collapse if supplies were completely cut off. The Japanese government responded with dramatic energy conservation measures and diplomatic initiatives. Prime Minister Kakuei Tanaka immediately distanced Japan from American Middle East policy, issued statements sympathetic to Arab positions on Palestine, and dispatched high-level missions to Arab capitals to secure continued oil supplies. Industrial production was curtailed, with factories operating on reduced schedules. Heating standards were lowered, with government buildings limited to 15 degrees Celsius (59 degrees Fahrenheit). Television stations ended broadcasting earlier in the evening. Speed limits were reduced. Citizens were urged to minimize energy consumption in daily life. These measures, combined with successful diplomacy, meant Japan avoided complete supply cutoffs and recovered more quickly than other industrialized nations. However, the crisis fundamentally shaped Japanese energy policy, driving investments in nuclear power, energy efficiency, and economic diversification away from energy-intensive industries. The automotive industry revolution. American manufacturers' crisis. The oil crisis exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in the American automotive industry. Detroit's Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, had built their business models around large, powerful, heavy vehicles with poor fuel economy. The typical American car in 1973 achieved approximately 13 miles per gallon, with popular models like the Chevrolet Impala, Ford LTD, and Plymouth Fury consuming even more. This design philosophy reflected several factors: cheap gasoline, American preferences for size and power, planned obsolescence strategies that emphasized styling changes over engineering improvements, and market segmentation that offered progressively larger models as aspirational purchases. The industry had dismissed smaller, more efficient vehicles as unprofitable economy segments with limited appeal. The crisis instantly reversed consumer preferences. Demand for large cars collapsed while interest in fuel-efficient vehicles surged. American manufacturers were catastrophically unprepared for this shift. Their small car offerings, models like the Ford Pinto, Chevrolet Vega, and AMC Gremlin, had reputations for poor quality and unreliability. Development of new fuel-efficient models would take years. Sales plummeted, inventories of unsold large cars accumulated, and financial losses mounted. Ford's 1974 profits fell 90% compared to 1973. Chrysler, the weakest of the Big Three, faced bankruptcy threats that would eventually require government intervention in 1979. Tens of thousands of workers were laid off as production was curtailed. Japanese manufacturers ascent. Japanese automakers, by contrast, were perfectly positioned to capitalize on the crisis. Companies like Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and Mazda had developed expertise in building smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles for their domestic market, where high gasoline prices and narrow roads made large American-style cars impractical. Models like the Toyota Corolla, Honda Civic, Datsun, Nissan 510, and Mazda GLC offered fuel economy of 25 to 35 miles per gallon, double or triple that of typical American cars. They were mechanically reliable, well-built, and increasingly well-equipped despite smaller size. They represented genuine engineering excellence rather than stripped-down economy vehicles. Japanese market share in the United States, which stood at approximately 15% before the crisis, grew rapidly, reaching 21% by 1975 and continuing upward. Toyota became the best-selling import brand, while Honda established itself as a major force. The Civic, in particular, became iconic as the sensible choice for fuel-conscious buyers. This success reflected not just fortuitous product positioning but fundamental differences in manufacturing philosophy. Japanese companies had adopted quality control methods, just-in-time production systems, and continuous improvement (Kaizen) practices that produced more reliable vehicles. They invested heavily in engineering efficiency rather than just styling. They listened carefully to customer feedback and responded quickly to market demands. The crisis permanently altered the global automotive hierarchy. Japanese manufacturers established strong positions in North American and European markets that they would never relinquish. American manufacturers lost market share they would never fully recover. The crisis accelerated the transformation of the automotive industry from an American-dominated sector to a global competitive marketplace. European manufacturers' response. European automakers occupied a middle position. Companies like Volkswagen, Fiat, Renault, Peugeot, and BMW had experience building smaller, more efficient vehicles for European markets where fuel had always been expensive. Models like the Volkswagen Golf, Rabbit in the US, Renault 5 and Fiat 128 offered good fuel economy and practical design. European manufacturers increased exports to the United States, though with less dramatic success than Japanese brands. Volkswagen, which had established a strong American presence with the Beetle, introduced the Golf/Rabbit as a modern, practical alternative. French and Italian brands achieved modest gains but never established the reliability reputation or dealer networks that Japanese companies built. The crisis reinforced existing European automotive strategies emphasizing efficiency, advanced diesel technology, and sophisticated engineering in smaller packages. European diesel passenger cars, virtually unknown in America, gained popularity in Europe as offering superior fuel economy. This diesel development would influence global automotive trends for decades. Energy policy transformations. United States strategic response. The oil crisis catalyzed fundamental changes in American energy policy. The federal government, which had largely left energy matters to market forces and private companies, recognized the need for comprehensive national energy strategy. In 1975, Congress established the Strategic Petroleum Reserve (SPR), authorizing creation of massive underground storage facilities to hold emergency oil supplies. The SPR eventually stored over 700 million barrels in salt caverns along the Gulf Coast, providing a buffer against future supply disruptions. This represented one of the most significant government interventions in energy markets in American history. The Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975 established corporate average fuel economy (CAFE) standards, requiring manufacturers to achieve specific fleet-wide fuel economy targets. Initial standards mandated 18 miles per gallon by 1978, rising to 27.5 miles per gallon by 1985, nearly doubling fuel efficiency requirements. This legislation forced fundamental changes in automotive design and remains central to fuel economy regulation today. The Department of Energy was established in 1977, consolidating various energy-related agencies and programs under cabinet-level authority. This reflected recognition that energy policy required coordinated federal oversight rather than fragmented agency management. Research funding for alternative energy dramatically increased. Solar, wind, geothermal, and nuclear power received substantial government support. President Jimmy Carter installed solar panels on the White House as a symbolic commitment to renewable energy, later removed by President Reagan. Synthetic fuels research attracted billions in federal investment, though with limited practical success. Conservation became a national priority. The 55 miles per hour national maximum speed limit, implemented in 1974 ostensibly for safety but primarily for fuel conservation, symbolized the shift toward energy consciousness. Building codes were revised to encourage insulation and energy efficiency. Daylight saving time was extended. Public awareness campaigns promoted energy conservation as a patriotic duty. European energy strategies. European nations, even more vulnerable to Middle Eastern supply disruptions, pursued aggressive energy diversification strategies. The crisis accelerated existing nuclear power programs, with France embarking on the most ambitious nuclear expansion in the world. By the 1980s, France generated over 70% of its electricity from nuclear plants, achieving substantial independence from oil for power generation. North Sea oil development became a strategic priority for Britain and Norway. Substantial petroleum reserves had been discovered in the North Sea in the 1960s, but development was expensive and technically challenging. The crisis made these projects economically viable and politically urgent. By the early 1980s, Britain became a net oil exporter, fundamentally altering its energy security position and providing substantial government revenues. Energy efficiency standards for buildings, appliances, and vehicles became far more stringent across Europe. European fuel economy standards exceeded American requirements, while building codes mandated substantial insulation and energy-efficient heating systems. High fuel taxes, always more substantial in Europe than America, were maintained and even increased, encouraging conservation and funding public transportation. Renewable energy research received substantial support, particularly in Denmark, wind power, Germany, solar, and various countries pursuing geothermal and hydroelectric development. These investments, while modest in immediate impact, laid groundwork for later renewable energy expansion. Japan's energy revolution. Japan pursued perhaps the most comprehensive energy policy response. The crisis traumatized Japanese leadership, who recognized that their economic miracle rested on vulnerable energy foundations. The government established aggressive energy security goals and implemented wide-ranging programs to achieve them. Nuclear power expansion became central to Japanese energy strategy. Japan built dozens of nuclear plants over the following decades, despite limited domestic uranium supplies and public concerns about nuclear safety, in the only nation to experience atomic weapons. By 2011, nuclear power provided approximately 30% of Japan's electricity. Energy efficiency became a national obsession. Japan implemented the strictest energy efficiency standards in the world for appliances, vehicles, and industrial processes. The Top Runner program required manufacturers to meet efficiency standards based on the most efficient products currently available, continuously pushing technological improvement. Industrial policy shifted toward less energy-intensive sectors. While maintaining strength in automotive and electronics manufacturing, Japan increasingly emphasized high-value, knowledge-intensive industries like semiconductors, precision equipment, and financial services. Heavy industries like steel and petrochemicals became less central to the economy. Japan invested heavily in energy conservation technology and became a world leader in efficient industrial processes, hybrid vehicles, LED lighting, and other energy-saving innovations. This technological leadership created export opportunities and competitive advantages beyond just energy security. Geopolitical realignments. OPEC's empowerment and transformation. The crisis fundamentally altered OPEC's role in the global economy. Previously a relatively weak organization of developing nations attempting to secure better terms from powerful Western oil companies, OPEC emerged as a force capable of dictating prices and production levels to the entire world. The massive wealth transfer from oil consumers to producers had profound effects. Oil exporting nations' revenues increased from approximately $23 billion in 1972 to $140 billion by 1977. This sudden accumulation of petrodollars gave oil producers unprecedented financial power and political influence. Saudi Arabia emerged as the dominant force within OPEC and in global oil markets. With the largest reserves and production capacity, Saudi Arabia could significantly influence prices by adjusting its output. The Saudi leadership, generally pro-Western despite the embargo, became a crucial partner for the United States in managing oil markets and Middle Eastern politics. However, OPEC solidarity proved fragile over time. Member states had divergent interests based on their reserve levels, production capacities, populations, and economic development needs. Nations with large populations and smaller reserves per capita, like Iran, Iraq, and Nigeria, favored high prices to maximize current revenue. Sparsely populated nations with massive reserves, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, had interests in long-term market stability and preventing high prices that might destroy demand or accelerate alternative energy development. U.S.-Saudi Strategic Partnership. The crisis paradoxically strengthened U.S.-Saudi relations despite the embargo. Both nations recognized mutual interests in stable oil markets, regional security, and containing Soviet influence. The United States needed reliable oil supplies and influence over OPEC pricing policies. Saudi Arabia needed security guarantees, military equipment, and investments for its petrodollar revenues. The U.S.-Saudi partnership became a cornerstone of American Middle East policy. The United States provided advanced military equipment, training, and implicit security guarantees protecting the Saudi kingdom from external threats. Saudi Arabia moderated oil prices, increased production when needed, and invested petrodollars in American financial markets and treasury bonds, helping finance American budget deficits. This partnership endured despite tensions over Israel, divergent values regarding democracy and human rights, and periodic disagreements over oil policy. The strategic logic underlying the relationship, American security guarantees in exchange for Saudi oil market management, remained powerful for both parties. Petrodollar recycling in global finance. The massive flow of wealth to oil producers created the petrodollar recycling phenomenon that reshaped global finance. Oil exporters accumulated revenues far exceeding their immediate spending capacity or domestic investment opportunities. These surplus funds needed to be invested somewhere, creating enormous financial flows back to consuming nations. Much of this money flowed into Western financial markets, particularly American banks and government securities. Oil exporters purchased U.S. Treasury bonds, corporate securities, real estate, and bank deposits. This recycling helped finance American budget and trade deficits, keeping interest rates lower than otherwise would have occurred. Western banks, flush with petrodollar deposits, aggressively lent to developing nations, contributing to the Third World Debt Crisis of the 1980s. Countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia borrowed heavily for development projects, often at floating interest rates that later increased dramatically when American monetary policy tightened to combat inflation. Petrodollars also funded development and modernization in oil-producing nations. Middle Eastern countries invested in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and industrial diversification. Cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Riyadh were transformed from modest towns to modern metropolises. This development had lasting effects on these societies, though not always positive ones, as traditional cultures and economies were rapidly disrupted. Shifts in Middle Eastern power dynamics. The crisis altered power relationships within the Middle East. Oil wealth gave producers new influence in regional affairs and global politics. Saudi Arabia, in particular, gained leverage well beyond what its small population and military capabilities would suggest. The oil weapon proved difficult to use effectively in subsequent conflicts. When Egypt and Syria went to war with Israel again in 1973, They hoped the oil embargo would force Western powers to pressure Israel into territorial concessions. While the embargo created economic problems for the West, it did not fundamentally alter American support for Israel or force the territorial outcomes Arab states desired. Subsequent attempts to use oil politically proved even less successful. The embargo had worked in 1973 partly because of unique circumstances: tight market conditions, high demand growth, limited spare capacity, and initial solidarity among Arab producers. Later efforts to weaponize oil faced greater challenges as consuming nations built strategic reserves, developed alternative supplies, and created more flexible, resilient economies. The crisis's success paradoxically limited future oil weapon effectiveness. By demonstrating the vulnerability of oil dependence, it motivated consuming nations to reduce that vulnerability. The higher prices triggered by the crisis encouraged conservation, efficiency improvements, and alternative energy development that ultimately weakened OPEC's market power. Long-term economic and structural changes. The end of post-war economic growth model. The crisis marked the end of the extraordinary post-World War II economic boom that had characterized the 1950s and 1960s. That era's combination of rapid growth, low inflation, and rising living standards gave way to stagflation, slower growth, and economic uncertainty. The cheap energy that had powered post-war expansion was gone permanently. Even as nominal prices eventually stabilized or declined in the 1980s, the real price of energy never returned to pre-1973 levels. Economic growth became more energy efficient but also slower, as the easy gains from abundant cheap energy were exhausted. The crisis contributed to fundamental changes in macroeconomic thinking. Keynesian economics, which had dominated policy-making in the post-war era, struggled to explain or address stagflation. Classical Keynesian models suggested unemployment and inflation moved inversely, the Phillips curve relationship. Stagflation violated this principle, creating both problems simultaneously. This theoretical crisis opened space for alternative economic approaches. Monetarist ideas, emphasizing control of money supply rather than fiscal policy, gained influence. Supply-side economics, arguing that tax cuts and deregulation would stimulate growth, became politically powerful in the late 1970s and 1980s. These intellectual shifts profoundly influenced policy in the Reagan-Thatcher era. Inflation and monetary policy transformation. The oil shock's inflationary impact contributed to the Great Inflation of the 1970s and early 1980s, when inflation rates in developed nations reached levels unprecedented in peacetime. This inflation reflected not just oil prices but also expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, wage price spirals, and expectations of continued price increases. Combating inflation became the dominant concern of central banks, leading to dramatic policy shifts. Paul Volcker, appointed Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979, implemented extremely tight monetary policy, raising interest rates to unprecedented levels. The federal funds rate exceeded 20% in 1981. This decisively broke inflation's momentum but caused severe recession in 1981 to 1982. The Volcker shock and similar policies in other developed nations established new norms for central banking emphasizing price stability over full employment or growth. The experience of 1970s stagflation convinced policymakers and economists that controlling inflation was central banking's primary responsibility. This philosophy, often called the Great Moderation Consensus, dominated monetary policy for decades. Deindustrialization and economic restructuring. The crisis accelerated deindustrialization in developed nations, particularly the United States. Energy-intensive heavy industries, steel, automotive, petrochemicals, manufacturing, faced higher operating costs, increased competition from more efficient foreign producers, and declining competitiveness. The American manufacturing belt became the Rust Belt, as factories closed and communities dependent on industrial employment declined. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Gary experienced population loss, unemployment, and urban decay. The social and political consequences of deindustrialization would shape American politics for generations. However, this painful restructuring also drove economic evolution toward less energy-intensive sectors. Service industries, information technology, finance, and knowledge-based sectors grew, eventually creating new sources of employment and growth. The American economy became more flexible and resilient, though this transition inflicted significant costs on displaced workers and communities. Global supply chains and manufacturing dispersed geographically. Production shifted toward locations with lower labor costs, more efficient energy use, or other competitive advantages. This globalization accelerated trends that would define the late 20th and early 21st century world economy. Development of alternative energy. The high energy prices resulting from the crisis made previously uneconomical energy sources viable. Oil that would have been too expensive to extract at $3 per barrel became profitable at $12 or higher. This economic shift drove development of North Sea oil and gas fields, requiring expensive offshore drilling technology in harsh conditions. Alaskan oil, particularly the Prudhoe Bay field and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. Canadian oil sands, containing vast resources but requiring energy-intensive extraction. Mexican oil fields in the Gulf of Mexico. These new supplies gradually reduced market tightness and OPEC's market share. Nuclear power expanded rapidly in many nations, despite growing public concern about safety and waste disposal. Dozens of plants were built in the United States, France, Japan, and other countries, providing baseload electricity generation independent of fossil fuels. Renewable energy research received unprecedented funding, though immediate practical impact was limited. Solar photovoltaic technology improved gradually. Wind power became economically viable in favorable locations. These investments created technological foundations for later renewable energy growth, though the 1970s technologies were expensive and inefficient compared to later developments. Synthetic fuels, attempts to create liquid fuels from coal, oil, shale, or other resources, attracted billions in research funding with limited success. The technologies proved expensive and environmentally problematic, while falling oil prices in the 1980s eliminated economic viability. Social and cultural impacts. Environmentalism and conservation consciousness. The crisis contributed to growing environmental consciousness that characterized the 1970s. The connection between energy consumption, pollution, resource depletion, and environmental degradation became more apparent. The first Earth Day had occurred in 1970. The oil crisis gave environmental concerns greater political salience and practical urgency. Conservation shifted from fringe environmentalist advocacy to mainstream policy. The idea that economic growth could be decoupled from energy consumption growth, that efficiency improvements could allow prosperity with less resource use, gained credibility. This represented a significant shift from the assumption that more energy use necessarily meant better living standards. The crisis also generated debate about limits to growth and sustainability. Books like The Limits to Growth, 1972, had warned that exponential consumption growth on a finite planet would lead to crisis. The oil shock seemed to validate these warnings, though later developments showed that technological change and market adaptation could postpone or mitigate resource constraints. Suburbanization and urban planning. The crisis temporarily slowed suburban sprawl and automobile-dependent development patterns. Higher gasoline prices made long commutes more expensive, increasing interest in urban living and transit-oriented development. Some planners and policymakers hoped for fundamental reordering of settlement patterns toward denser, more energy-efficient configurations. However, these changes proved largely temporary. As economic conditions improved and real energy prices declined in the 1980s, suburban expansion resumed. American development patterns remained heavily automobile-dependent, though vehicles became more efficient. The crisis did not fundamentally alter American preferences for suburban living or the political and economic forces driving suburban development. Europe and Japan, with higher energy prices and more compact urban forms, continued development patterns emphasizing public transit, walkable neighborhoods, and mixed-use development. The crisis reinforced existing differences in urban structure between North America and other developed regions. Generational impacts and cultural memory. For Americans and Europeans who experienced it, the oil crisis left lasting impressions. Gas lines, economic hardship, and the sense of national vulnerability became defining memories of the 1970s. The crisis contributed to a broader malaise characterizing that decade, a sense that American power and prosperity were declining, that the optimism of the 1950s and 1960s had been misplaced. Younger generations who did not experience the crisis directly often lack appreciation for its significance. Cheap gasoline returned in the 1980s and 1990s, and concerns about energy security faded. Large, fuel-inefficient vehicles regained popularity. The lessons of 1973 seemed forgotten, contributing to vulnerability when oil prices spiked again in the 2000s. The crisis shaped political attitudes and policy debates for decades. Arguments about energy independence, the strategic importance of Middle Eastern oil, the viability of alternative energy, and the role of government in energy markets referenced the 1973 experience. Political divisions over environmental regulation, fuel economy standards, and energy policy often traced back to different interpretations of the crisis's lessons. Why the crisis occurred. Causal analysis. Structural factors. The crisis resulted from fundamental structural vulnerabilities in the global energy system. Decades of cheap oil had created enormous dependence without corresponding supply security. The concentration of major oil reserves in a politically unstable region, the lack of spare production capacity, and the absence of strategic reserves created conditions where relatively modest supply disruptions could cause disproportionate impacts. The shift from American dominance of oil production to Middle Eastern dominance had profound implications. When the United States was the world's leading producer, American political and economic interests aligned with supply stability. Once production shifted to the Middle East, suppliers' political interests often diverged from those of major consumers, creating potential for supply disruptions driven by geopolitical conflicts rather than economic considerations. The structure of the oil industry, with Western companies controlling production while Middle Eastern nations owned the reserves, was fundamentally unstable. This colonial-era arrangement was increasingly unacceptable to producer nations seeking control over their resources and greater economic benefits. The crisis accelerated nationalization and the transfer of control from oil companies to producer governments. Political triggers. The immediate political trigger was the Yom Kippur War and Western support for Israel. However, this reflected deeper political dynamics in the Middle East. The Arab-Israeli conflict, itself rooted in decades of history, provided the occasion for using the oil weapon, but broader Arab frustration with Western policies and desire to assert greater influence drove the decision. American foreign policy had created resentments that contributed to the crisis. Unqualified support for Israel, regardless of Arab concerns or Palestinian rights, alienated Arab populations and governments. The perception that the United States and other Western powers treated the Middle East primarily as a source of cheap energy rather than as peoples and nations with legitimate interests created political conditions favorable to using oil as a weapon. The Cold War context was crucial. Soviet support for Arab nations and American support for Israel made the Arab-Israeli conflict a proxy battleground. The superpowers' involvement raised the stakes, intensified the conflict, and contributed to the decision to use oil politically. Arab nations saw the oil weapon partly as a counter to American military and economic support for Israel. Economic preconditions. Economic conditions in the early 1970s created vulnerability to supply shocks. Demand for oil had grown rapidly throughout the post-war period, driven by economic expansion, population growth, and increasing automobile ownership. By 1973, global demand was pressing against production capacity, reducing the cushion that might have absorbed supply disruptions. The peaking of American oil production in 1970 was particularly significant. The United States had historically served as the world's swing producer, capable of increasing production to offset shortages elsewhere. With domestic production declining, America lost this capacity and became increasingly dependent on imports. This meant that global oil markets had less flexibility to respond to disruptions. Spare production capacity globally had declined to minimal levels by 1973. In previous decades, major producers typically maintained 20 to 25% spare capacity that could be quickly brought online during disruptions. By 1973, this cushion had nearly disappeared as demand growth absorbed available capacity. This meant that even modest production cuts could create severe shortages. The structure of oil contracts and pricing mechanisms was changing. The system where Western oil companies set prices through posted prices was collapsing. Producer nations increasingly demanded and achieved control over pricing. This transition created uncertainty and volatility, making the market more susceptible to dramatic price swings when supply conditions changed. Market dynamics and psychology. Psychological factors amplified the crisis beyond what physical supply constraints alone would have caused. Fear of shortages led to hoarding behavior by consumers, governments, and companies, creating self-fulfilling shortages. Motorists topped off tanks more frequently, reducing the efficiency of the distribution system. Companies and countries built inventories, removing additional supply from markets. Speculation in oil markets contributed to price volatility. As prices rose, market participants anticipated further increases, creating incentives to hold inventory rather than sell. This speculative demand added to physical demand, pushing prices higher and creating a feedback loop that amplified price increases beyond what supply-demand fundamentals alone would suggest. The lack of transparent price discovery mechanisms meant that prices were determined through negotiations, spot markets, and informal arrangements rather than efficient, liquid markets. This opacity allowed for greater price volatility and made it difficult for consumers to respond efficiently to changing conditions. Media coverage and public attention created political pressures that governments felt compelled to address through dramatic action. Images of gas lines and stories of economic hardship generated demands for government intervention. This political dynamic sometimes led to policies that worsened problems, such as price controls that discouraged production and encouraged consumption, exacerbating shortages. Frequently asked questions. Why did Arab nations choose to use oil as a weapon specifically in 1973? Several factors converged to make 1973 the moment when oil became a political weapon. First, market conditions were favorable. Tight supply-demand balance meant that production cuts would have maximum impact. Second, the Yom Kippur War provided both justification and motivation, as Arab nations sought to pressure Western supporters of Israel. Third, producer nations had achieved sufficient control over their oil industries to implement such policies unilaterally, no longer constrained by Western oil companies. Fourth, the failure of previous military efforts to achieve political objectives led Arab leaders to seek alternative means of pressure. Finally, there was unprecedented unity among Arab oil producers, driven by shared frustration with Western Middle East policies and the emotional impact of another Arab-Israeli war. Could Western nations have prevented the crisis? Prevention would have required fundamentally different policies years or decades earlier. Reducing dependence on Middle Eastern oil through conservation, alternative energy development, and diversified supply sources would have reduced vulnerability, but these efforts required sustained commitment and investment that didn't occur when oil was cheap and abundant. Different Middle East policy, particularly regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict, might have reduced Arab motivation to use the oil weapon, but this would have required American administrations to prioritize energy security over other foreign policy objectives and domestic political considerations. Building strategic petroleum reserves before the crisis would have provided buffer capacity to absorb supply disruptions, but this required foresight that policymakers lacked when oil seemed abundant and cheap. Maintaining spare production capacity in non-Middle Eastern sources would have provided flexibility, but economic forces favored maximizing production from lowest-cost sources. In retrospect, the crisis appears nearly inevitable given the trajectory of energy dependence, Middle Eastern politics, and Western policy choices. Why did the embargo end in March 1974? Multiple factors led to lifting the embargo. The immediate military situation that prompted the embargo had been resolved through ceasefire and disengagement agreements negotiated by U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Arab nations recognized that the embargo was damaging their own economic interests without achieving political objectives. It created resentment without forcing fundamental changes in Western policy toward Israel. The economic hardship caused by the embargo generated internal pressures within producing nations, as reduced production meant reduced revenues at a time when development needs were urgent. Divisions emerged among Arab producers about strategy, with some nations prioritizing economic benefits over continued political pressure. The United States and other Western nations were implementing policies to reduce oil dependence, threatening long-term market share for producers. Consumer nations were developing alternative supplies, making prolonged embargo less effective. Saudi Arabia, the most influential producer, favored ending the embargo to maintain long-term market stability and the U.S.-Saudi relationship. How did the crisis affect developing nations not involved in the conflict? Non-oil-producing developing nations were devastated by the crisis. These countries imported oil for essential needs, transportation, agriculture, industry, power generation, and had no alternative sources or strategic reserves. The quadrupling of oil prices created enormous balance of payments problems, forcing difficult choices between importing essential energy and other development priorities. Agricultural production suffered as fertilizer and fuel costs increased, threatening food security. Industrial development was constrained by higher energy costs and reduced demand from developed nations entering recession. Many developing nations borrowed heavily to finance oil imports, contributing to debt crises in the 1980s when interest rates increased and export earnings declined. The crisis widened gaps between oil-exporting developing nations, who benefited enormously, and oil-importing developing nations, who suffered disproportionately. Some developing nations successfully adjusted through aggressive energy conservation and economic restructuring, while others experienced decades of economic stagnation. The differential impact on developing nations based on resource endowments contributed to divergent development trajectories. Did the crisis actually reduce oil consumption permanently? The crisis had mixed effects on consumption. In the immediate term, high prices and recession sharply reduced consumption in developed nations. U.S. oil consumption declined from approximately 17 million barrels per day in 1973 to 16 million in 1975. However, as the economy recovered and real oil prices declined in the 1980s, consumption resumed growth. By 1979, U.S. consumption exceeded pre-crisis levels. The more significant impact was on energy intensity, the amount of energy required per unit of economic output. Energy efficiency improvements, fuel economy standards, conservation technologies, and economic restructuring toward less energy-intensive sectors meant that economic growth became less dependent on energy consumption growth. Developed nations achieved substantial GDP growth from the 1980s onward with relatively modest increases in energy consumption. This decoupling of growth and energy use represented a fundamental shift, though total consumption continued increasing. Developing nations, particularly China and India, drove most subsequent global oil demand growth as their economies industrialized and vehicle ownership expanded. Why didn't the crisis lead to immediate transition away from fossil fuels? Several factors prevented rapid energy transition despite the crisis's shock. First, alternative energy technologies were immature and expensive in the 1970s. Solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries were far less efficient and much more costly than today. Second, fossil fuel infrastructure represented enormous sunk investments, refineries, pipelines, power plants, vehicles, heating systems that couldn't be quickly replaced. Third, oil prices eventually declined in real terms during the 1980s and 1990s as new supplies came online and conservation reduced demand growth, eliminating economic incentives for alternatives. Fourth, powerful political and economic interests benefited from fossil fuel dependence and resisted transition efforts. Fifth, government's commitment to alternative energy wavered as the crisis receded from memory. Solar panels were removed from the White House, research funding declined, and policy attention shifted. Sixth, without effective carbon pricing or other mechanisms to account for environmental costs, fossil fuels remained economically attractive despite their externalities. The crisis did plant seeds for eventual transition by funding research, developing technologies, and establishing policy frameworks, but mature, cost-competitive alternatives took decades to emerge. How did the crisis change American foreign policy toward the Middle East? The crisis fundamentally altered American strategic thinking about the Middle East. Energy security became a central foreign policy concern, not just an economic issue. The Carter Doctrine, 1980, explicitly stated that attempts to gain control of Persian Gulf oil would be regarded as an assault on American vital interests, justifying military response. This represented unprecedented commitment to Middle Eastern stability and oil flow. Military presence in the region expanded dramatically, with bases, naval forces, and security agreements ensuring American capacity to protect oil infrastructure and sea lanes. The U.S.-Saudi relationship became a cornerstone of policy, despite tensions over other issues, because Saudi Arabia's oil market management served American interests. American policy became more actively engaged in Arab-Israeli peace efforts, recognizing that unresolved conflict threatened oil supplies, leading to initiatives like the Camp David Accords, 1978, between Egypt and Israel. Intelligence and military efforts focused on preventing hostile powers from controlling major oil reserves, influencing policy toward Iran, Iraq, and other regional powers. The crisis established patterns of American Middle Eastern involvement that persist today, including military presence, security commitments, and prioritization of energy security in policy calculations. What role did speculation and market psychology play in price increases? Psychological factors and speculation significantly amplified price increases beyond physical supply constraints. Fear and uncertainty generated hoarding behavior at multiple levels. Consumers filled tanks more frequently, companies built inventories, governments stockpiled supplies. This precautionary demand removed oil from circulation, tightening markets beyond actual production cuts. Expectations of future price increases created incentives to hold inventory rather than sell, reducing current supply and pushing prices higher in a self-reinforcing cycle. Limited price transparency and imperfect information meant market participants couldn't accurately assess supply-demand balance, leading to overreaction. Media coverage of gas lines and shortages created panic buying that worsened shortages, Stations ran out not because overall supply was exhausted but because distribution systems couldn't handle surges in demand. Price controls in some countries created artificial shortages by discouraging production and encouraging consumption, making problems worse despite intentions to help consumers. Some analysts estimate that 30 to 40% of the price increase resulted from market psychology and speculation rather than fundamental supply-demand factors. However, underlying fundamentals, actual production cuts and tight market conditions, created the foundation for psychological factors to amplify effects. How did the crisis affect relations between oil companies and producing nations? The crisis marked the definitive end of Western oil company dominance over Middle Eastern oil. Producer nations completed nationalization of oil assets, taking full control of production decisions and reserves. Oil companies transitioned from owners and operators to contractors providing technical services, fundamentally changing their role and reducing their power. Producer governments, not companies, now determined production levels, pricing, and contract terms. This represented reversal of the concession system that had given companies control since the early 20th century. However, companies adapted and often thrived in new arrangements. They provided essential technical expertise, marketing capabilities, and management skills that producer nations needed. Many companies secured long-term service contracts, purchasing agreements, and joint ventures that remained profitable despite lost ownership. The crisis demonstrated that companies couldn't protect their interests through political pressure on Western governments. Producing nations had sufficient leverage to impose their preferences. Some companies diversified away from crude oil production toward refining, petrochemicals, and downstream operations where they maintained advantages. The relationship evolved from colonial-style exploitation toward more balanced commercial partnerships, though tensions and disputes continued over contract terms, technology transfer, and profit sharing. Why did some Western nations respond differently to the crisis? National responses varied based on several factors. Energy dependence levels shaped urgency and policy choices. Japan, importing 99% of its oil, responded more aggressively than the United States, which still produced substantial domestic oil. Political relationships with Arab nations influenced policy. The Netherlands, explicitly targeted by the embargo, faced different pressures than France, which had cultivated closer Arab ties. Economic structures affected vulnerability. Countries with energy-intensive manufacturing suffered more than service-oriented economies. Existing policy frameworks mattered. Nations with strong government intervention traditions, France, Japan, implemented coordinated responses more easily than those favoring market solutions, United States. Prior energy policies created different starting positions. Countries that had maintained higher fuel taxes and encouraged efficiency, European nations, adjusted more easily than those with cheap energy, United States. Political systems influenced response speed and consistency. Parliamentary systems sometimes enabled faster policy changes than the American separation of powers system. Strategic considerations shaped choices. Some nations prioritized Atlantic solidarity while others pursued independent arrangements with producers. These variations produced diverse policy approaches, from aggressive conservation and nuclear power, Japan, France, to market-oriented responses and domestic production emphasis, United States, to diplomatic engagement with producers, France. What were the long-term geopolitical consequences of the crisis? The crisis reshaped global geopolitics in lasting ways. OPEC and oil-producing nations gained unprecedented influence in international affairs, transforming previously peripheral states into major powers. The massive wealth transfer from consumers to producers funded development, military expansion, and political influence operations that changed regional dynamics. The U.S. military presence in the Middle East expanded dramatically and became permanent, establishing American force projection capabilities that influenced regional conflicts for decades. The crisis accelerated petrodollar recycling that integrated Middle Eastern oil producers into Western financial systems, creating mutual dependencies that complicated relationships. European unity efforts faced setbacks as the crisis exposed divisions and inability to coordinate responses, though this eventually motivated stronger integration efforts. Japan's response to the crisis drove economic strategies emphasizing efficiency and technological innovation that enhanced its competitive position. The crisis demonstrated limits of American power. The inability to prevent or quickly resolve the crisis challenged assumptions about American dominance. Developing nations witnessed successful assertion of resource sovereignty by OPEC, inspiring similar efforts to gain control over natural resources and better terms in international economic relations. The crisis established energy security as a permanent high-priority concern in national security planning, shaping military deployments, alliance structures and strategic calculations. How accurate were predictions that oil would run out? Dire predictions about imminent oil depletion proved incorrect, though not entirely misguided. Peak oil predictions that global production would soon reach maximum levels and enter permanent decline were premature. Production continued growing for decades as technology improved and new reserves were discovered. Estimates of proven reserves consistently underestimated ultimately recoverable resources because they didn't account for technological advances in exploration, drilling, and extraction. Higher prices made previously uneconomical resources viable: deep water drilling, oil sands, tight oil from fracking, expanding available supplies far beyond 1970s expectations. Enhanced recovery techniques extracted more oil from existing fields than originally thought possible. However, the fundamental insight that fossil fuels are finite resources remained valid. The easy oil, large accessible reservoirs that could be produced cheaply, has largely been exploited, forcing production from more difficult, expensive sources. Energy return on investment (EROI) has declined as simpler sources are exhausted and production moves to complex extraction. The predictions were wrong about timing but correct about direction. Fossil fuel dependence is ultimately unsustainable, though the timeline proved much longer than 1970s fears suggested. The crisis did successfully motivate efficiency improvements that extended oil's viability and reduced consumption growth. What lessons from 1973 are relevant to current energy challenges? Several lessons remain pertinent. Energy security requires diversification of sources and technologies. Dependence on any single source or region creates vulnerability to supply disruptions. Strategic reserves and emergency response capabilities provide crucial buffers during crises. Nations without reserves or response plans suffer disproportionately. Energy efficiency and conservation are often more cost-effective than supply expansion for enhancing security and reducing vulnerability. Market psychology and speculation can amplify crises beyond physical fundamentals. Panic and hoarding worsen shortages even when overall supply is adequate. Government policy plays essential roles in driving long-term energy transitions that markets alone won't achieve. Fuel economy standards, research funding, and infrastructure investments require policy intervention. International cooperation is difficult during crises as nations pursue individual interests. Energy security cooperation requires frameworks established before emergencies occur. Transitions between energy systems take decades even with strong motivation. Infrastructure, technology, and behavior don't change quickly. Using essential resources as political weapons creates backlash and accelerates efforts to reduce dependence. The oil weapon's success in 1973 motivated responses that eventually weakened OPEC's power. The crisis also demonstrates that resources thought scarce may prove more abundant than feared, but this shouldn't encourage complacency about finite resources or environmental impacts. Current transitions toward renewable energy face similar challenges. Technological maturation, infrastructure development, cost reduction, and political commitment all require sustained effort over decades. Conclusion: historical significance and legacy. The 1973 oil crisis stands as a watershed moment in modern economic and political history. It shattered assumptions about perpetual economic growth fueled by cheap, abundant energy. It demonstrated the vulnerability of industrialized societies to supply disruptions of essential resources. It revealed the geopolitical power that resource control conveys to producing nations. It triggered economic hardship, policy transformations, and strategic realignments whose effects persisted for decades. The crisis marked the end of the post-World War II economic order characterized by American dominance, rapid growth, and energy abundance. It ushered in an era of greater economic uncertainty, geopolitical complexity, and recognition of resource constraints. The easy optimism of the 1950s and 1960s gave way to more sober assessments of limits and challenges. Yet the crisis also demonstrated human adaptability and technological capability. The predicted catastrophic outcomes, societal collapse, permanent economic decline, resource wars, did not materialize. Instead, markets adjusted, technologies improved, policies evolved, and economies adapted. Energy efficiency increased dramatically. Alternative sources were developed. Economic growth resumed, though on different terms than before. The crisis fundamentally changed how nations think about energy, security, and economic policy. Energy security became a permanent strategic priority. The connection between foreign policy and resource access became explicit. The potential for resource scarcity to disrupt economic systems and international relations was undeniable. These recognitions continue shaping policy decisions today. The automotive industry was transformed permanently. The dominance of American manufacturers was broken. Japanese and later Korean companies established positions they never relinquished. Vehicle efficiency became a central design consideration rather than an afterthought. The crisis accelerated globalization of manufacturing and established new competitive dynamics. For the Middle East, the crisis brought enormous wealth and enhanced international influence, but also created new challenges. The massive influx of petrodollars enabled development but also contributed to political instability, corruption, and conflicts over resource control. The region's integration into global energy systems brought both prosperity and vulnerability. The oil weapon proved a double-edged sword. Its successful use in 1973 demonstrated producers' power but also motivated consuming nations to reduce dependence, ultimately weakening that power over time. The crisis showed that resource leverage can be effective in the short term but may undermine itself in the long term by changing consumer behavior and incentivizing alternatives. The environmental legacy is complex. Higher energy prices encouraged conservation and efficiency, reducing emissions growth below what otherwise would have occurred. However, the crisis did not fundamentally shift energy systems away from fossil fuels. Temporary enthusiasm for alternatives faded when prices declined. Decades later, climate change presents challenges that the 1973 crisis foreshadowed but did not resolve. The crisis's psychological and cultural impact lingers in collective memory, particularly for those who experienced it directly. Images of gas lines symbolize an era of limits and vulnerability. The crisis contributed to broader 1970s disillusionment with American power and optimism about perpetual progress. It represented a loss of innocence about resource abundance and economic security. Looking back from the perspective of more than 50 years, the 1973 oil crisis appears as a critical juncture in the transition from a 20th-century order based on fossil fuel abundance to a 21st-century reality of resource constraints, geopolitical competition over energy, and growing recognition of environmental limits. The crisis didn't resolve these challenges but made them impossible to ignore. It forced difficult questions about sustainability, equity, and the relationship between economic growth and resource consumption that remain central to contemporary debates. The crisis demonstrated that seemingly stable systems can be disrupted suddenly by political decisions, market dynamics, or the intersection of both. It showed that economic models based on assumptions of continued cheap energy are vulnerable to rapid obsolescence when circumstances change. It revealed that technological and policy responses to crises take time to develop and implement, requiring sustained commitment even after immediate pressures ease. Perhaps most significantly, the 1973 oil crisis illustrated the deep connections between energy, economics, geopolitics, and society. Energy is not merely a commodity but a foundation of modern civilization whose availability and price affects virtually every aspect of economic and social life. Control over energy resources conveys power. Dependence on energy creates vulnerability. The political economy of energy shapes international relations, domestic politics, and social structures in profound ways. These insights, learned painfully through the experience of 1973, remain relevant as the world confronts contemporary energy challenges, climate change, resource depletion, geopolitical competition, and the transition toward sustainable energy systems. The crisis provides both warnings about the disruptions that energy transitions can cause and evidence that societies can adapt to dramatic changes when necessary. Understanding this historical experience enriches analysis of current challenges and potential futures.